Greetings and salutations. Welcome, welcome, welcome. My mic is peeking in. I wanted to talk about one more thing in Barbarians of Lemuria before I got too deep into other things. I had talked before about their boons and banes. All right, did they call them boons and banes? They call them boons and something else. And those essentially those occupations in the system. But one of the other things I really like about Barbarians of Lemuria is their ad-hoc magic system. By ad-hoc, I mean that you can kind of create spells on the fly. I ran a one-shot in Barbarians of Lemuria a while ago. Nobody played a wizard, so I didn't really get to play with it much as a GM. I did play in, unfortunately, it was a rather short run, a play-by-post of Barbarians of Lemuria, and I played a magician or magic user, and so I got to play with the spells as a player, and I like them a lot. I don't know, so we're going to read through it, and we can kind of discuss if we think this is something that, I mean, one, if it's something you might just find useful in total or in part to, excuse me, as I'm knocking things around, to adapt elsewhere. But I really liked it, and I thought it was something to highlight about the system. And I thought, well, since I just done some Barbarians of Lemuria last week, I guess, before I kind of put it away for the time being, we can dig into it, check it out. So, hey, Phil says, looking forward to this. Oh, great. You're working on Barbarian magic stuff for 5e. Awesome. So maybe you'll find this useful to your pursuits. So let's flip into the PDF. And again, I'm reading from I think it's called the Mythic edition, which I've linked to in the show notes on Drive-Thru. I believe there's some other editions as well. There may even be a free edition. And then there's a legendary edition. I don't know if content-wise, they're all this. I don't know the differences between if there's a free edition, which I can't remember. Legendary, I know there's a legendary edition and this Mythic edition. I don't know if there are differences. I'm going for this one. Oh, thanks. It says your insights are usually very useful. Well, I'm glad. I am glad to hear it. So I'm just going to dig into it, and we'll go from there. I'm going to skip the reading from Krongar's saga, though I'm sure it is suitably heroic and epic. Magicians in Barbarians of Lemuria are normally the bad guys, the villains to be hunted down and destroyed. They are generally feared not only because of their strange habits and nocturnal ways, but also because of the powers they wield are not understood and can be devastating, if also unpredictable. In game terms, the most powerful of the spells that these individuals can perform take a great deal of time and research, something there is not a lot of during the course of a normal adventure. So sorcery is not something to be taken lightly and not generally taken up by PCs. However, there are some examples of our magician heroes in sword and sorcery fiction, so this career can make a viable option for players if they understand the possible restrictions they might face. Get to a header. Arcane power. Characters with points in the magician career begin play with arcane power equal to 10 plus their magician rank. NPC rabble magicians, adepts, students, and apprentices start with 1, 2, or 3 arcane power, equivalent to their lifeblood, aka their hit points. So it does get, the way they're doing this, it is going to get a little bit mathy. And one of the things which I think just in advance, if you were going to bring this into your game, or even if you're playing Barbarians of Lemuria, you have to mitigate is that when you're creating a spell on the fly, you have to do this kind of some math kind of work. And I think in here they will tell us, and if they don't tell us, then I would definitely suggest that if you were to play a magician in this kind of system or magic user, whatever you want to call it, that you pre-create some spells that you can work with the GM on and figure out the logistics. And we're going to go through the logistics in a minute, kind of figure out all that stuff works in advance so that you have some stuff. When I played a magician in this system, I had because it was play by post, I had a lot of time to consider my spells, to send messages to the GM pitching, hey, here's the spell, here the way I think it should work, and then they could come back to me and say, okay, let's tweak this or that, or I see it this way, and kind of come to all that without really slowing the game down. Whereas in a face-to-face session, whether it's a synchronous session, whether it's online or in person, it could potentially get bogged down. And I haven't done it in person because when I ran a game in person, we didn't have a magician, and again, the other game was asynchronous, so the time didn't matter so much. So you definitely want to keep that in mind. Spell magnitude. All spells fall into one of 4 classes: cantrips and spells of the first, second, or third magnitude. Magicians always have rune-inscribed rings, amulets, talismans, and trinkets and so forth about their bodies, through which they can cast very minor and simple tricks called cantrips. If they are stripped of these items, they have difficulty even with these cantrips. Spells of increasing magnitude have a greater cost and arcane power and increasing difficulty levels to successfully cast. The spell power costs and difficulties table highlights these. Mind-affecting spells that directly interfere with a person's psyche or his perceptions, such as mind control and mind reading, have an additional modifier based on the mind rating of the victim of the spell. So in D&D terms, I guess we maybe we could call it, could probably even be intelligence or wisdom. I forget which one, that if they're mapping it onto one of those directly, but you could see either way. I think classically wisdom affects your saving throw versus spells and the like, so maybe we would say that would be wisdom. Healing with arcane power. Our sorcery does not lend itself to healing injuries of any sort. Accordingly, magicians cannot cast spells that repair damage to living things, although they can repair inanimate objects or items using magic. Sorcery and armor. Magic is difficult to perform whilst restricted by armor and costs the magician a greater amount of arcane power. For light armor, 1 extra arcane power point is used. For each heavier armor type, add 1 point of arcane power to the casting cost. So they haven't really gotten into the detail yet, right? But you're going to be building up the cost of the spell. And then, if I'm remembering correctly, because I haven't read this in a while, so I'm sort of in some ways refreshing myself as I'm reading it to you. You're going to build up a cost of the spell, and then you can do things, actions, and things like how long you want to take to cast the spell. Is there a preferable time of day to cast a spell? Do you have other things that can then mitigate that cost down to something that you can potentially afford? So you're going to create an overall cost for the spell, and then you kind of try to whittle it down. If you don't have the energy to pay for it altogether, trying to whittle it down to something you can manage, which I think is a nice balancing concept. So maybe you get to, hey, I can cast this just gigantic fireball, but if I'm going to do that, it's going to take an hour ritual, right? So that it automatically adds some interesting limitations. Or if you say, well, I don't have an hour to cast it because these kobolds aren't going to sit there and wait for me to cast this giant fireball, maybe I have to be screaming, I have to be loud, I have to have some other things, and that will maybe make it not take off as much energy as if I'd spend an hour ritual, but maybe that will get it down. Or I have to do something else, or I have to tweak the spell to fit within my limits. But at least in this case, you as playing the magician, obviously working with the GM, but you will be able to decide what you want to do to mitigate it. And the sort of inverse of that is if you want to have maybe a small spell or, a cantrip or something, a very light or small or just not a very powerful spell, but you want to cast it silently, cast it without letting other people around you know you've cast it, I think you can increase the cost by making it less visible. Or I think it might be that if it's a low level spell and you can just cast it, you have the points to cast it, then you don't have to do any rituals because you don't have to drive the cost down. So either way, you have this ability to either be sort of loud and in front or maybe stealthy if you want to. You just have to pay the cost accordingly, pursuant to, obviously, depending on what your magician can afford. All right, so 2 cantrips. These are very basic spells, allowing the caster to conjure a brief pool of light, the distant sound of laughter, or a spark to light a fire. Cantrips can be used to repair a common object, sour a jug of ale, or make the brief illusion of a common object. Other examples might include making a coin vanish, causing a rope to slither up a castle wall, or distracting a guard with an imagined sound. Such spells rarely cost more than 1 arcane power and only require a skill roll when directly affecting a sentient target, or perhaps if the magician has been deprived of his trinkets and fetishes, when the arcane power cost will be higher too. So you saw a bunch of suggestions. Some of them fit in sort of the D&D sense of kind of cantrips that you might be useful to, but other ones a bit more useful, or those situational. Having a rope snake up a castle wall might be really good, but of course that doesn't necessarily mean that it attaches itself to the wall and lets you climb it. You might have to do something else to tie it around a crenellation, something, but you can kind of do that, right? So suggestions, and I think when I was playing my magician, I definitely leaned into these examples to kind of get a feel for where the power level will be. Of course, if you're GMing a game, you'll want to set up or at least be mindful of where you think you're going to draw the lines between, oh, okay, this fits in this cantrip, or no, it has to be something more powerful. Some more suggestions they have: foul food, illusory sounds, a minor curse, momentary clumsiness, pain, a paralyzing gaze. More powerful spells are trickier, though, and are really the stuff of heroic magicians and villainous sorcerers. So then they just give us a little summary, right? Cantrips are going to cost 1 or 2 arcane power. So notice they're not free. They're not like cantrips in 5th edition where you can just cast them willy-nilly. But if you have, let's say, you're a character at the beginning of your Barbarians of Lemuria game, and your highest ranked career was magician, you would start with 14 arcane power. So if you just spend it on cantrips, you could do 7 to 14 cantrips before you would run dry. So not unlimited, but a pretty good number of spells. Let's see. Okay, spells of the first magnitude. These tend to be spells that the magician can cast during the course of an adventure. They are utility spells. They allow the sorcerer to perform activities that anyone with the right training and equipment could manage. Such sorcery might allow the caster to glide up the side of a cliff. Oops, where am I? Since a normal person with a rope and pitons could achieve the same result eventually. Damaging spells of this type would typically cause 1d6 lifeblood or hit points of damage to the target. These spells cost 5 arcane power of price 2. You must select one casting requirement to be able to produce a spell at all. For every additional casting requirement that the magician can meet in full, reduce the power cost by 1 point. The minimum arcane power cost of a first magnitude spell is always 2. Okay, so I don't want to end the stream. All right. All right. Can folks hear me now? Can folks hear me now? Wunderbar. Hide. I'm back. All right. Good to be back. And hopefully the PDF will swing back in. Oh, but man, it's showing my bandwidth is garbage. So hopefully it'll be. Why is it not? Okay. I am back. All right. Good. All right. Great. Let me know if anything else goes wonky. All right. So back to where I was. The first magnitude stuff is essentially, which I really like. They have, which is if you think about what another character could do with sort of their standard equipment, standard stuff, not theirs or abilities, just standard, then when you're kind of mimicking that, but you can do it in a magical effect. So like their example of, right, a normal person with rope and maybe some climbing claws or pythons can climb this wall. So now the wizard can levitate up the wall. The ends are the same. The means end up being different. And the same thing, if you want to use it to cause damage in combat, it's essentially the same as sword or other weapon. So a D6 HP of damage, but you're doing it through magical means, which is really a great way to think about it, because I think it really distills the conversation with the GM. If it's something that's clearly within the realm of another kind of character doing it with normal equipment, certainly if you're in a party and the fighter does this, the rogue does this, you can say, well, I want to simulate a similar, basically the same effect, but I'm going to do it through magic. You can make that case. And though they do have some, suggestions, fear, illusions, visions of close or recent happenings, minor demons, summoning minor demons, which obviously some of these you look at, well, these are things that other people can do. Know about how, say, via a reaction roll, a fighter might inspire fear. You're inspiring fear for similar purposes. And a demon, summoning a demon is something that another could do. What the demon does is essentially the character. You look like that. So spells of the first magnitude, they're going to cost 5 arcane power, and you must add. You get to pick the requirement, and I just saw another blip, so hopefully it's okay. Am I still here? Am I still here? Okay. So you're going to have to pick one requirement, additional requirements to low cost, no more than from to 2. Reload the page. It's happening again. From 5 to 2. Let me know if I keep getting these blips. It's still seen and heard. Keep getting blips. So that's where you end up with this level of magic. Now we can get into the requirements, which are a special item. And here they have some examples: an ancient tome, a heavy tablet, a delicate scroll is required, but it's relatively easy to come by. Okay, but I'm back now. All right, so let me back up. I seem like my connection's better now. I think. I like the first magnitude because essentially you're replicating the effects of normal people, and even these things like fear, illusions, vision, summoning minor demons. In essence, you're still kind of in that idea of these things are kind of replicating what other folks could do somewhat normally. you have to pick a casting requirement, and you need to fulfill that casting requirement to cast the spell. In addition, you can take more requirements to lower the cost of the spell, starting from 5, going down to 2. So let's look at some of those casting requirements. Special items could be an ancient tome, a heavy tablet, a delicate scroll. These are required, but they're not hard to come by. Relatively easy. You might need to barter, go on a short journey, or make a minor expenditure. Line of sight. That could be one. You must be able to clearly see the intended target. Casting time. The spell takes at least 30 to 180 minutes of meditation, chanting, dancing, etc. Intimate materials, which is one I liked when I was playing my magician. A personal item of the intended target or a tile from the target building, for example, is required. Special knowledge is another one. You must conduct lengthy research before you have all the information you need to cast a spell. Obvious technique. This is obviously where you are waving your arms around. You're doing all kinds of stuff. You're obviously casting a spell. And you're casting it at an auspicious hour. You have to pick an hour of the day in which you can cast. Hold on, I'm just going to check in the chat real quick. My background. Let's see. Ritual cleansing. You have to bathe in clean water and essential oils. Shave all your body hair. Wounds. You have to damage yourself, or you have to do it as a group. And here they have an example which I will read. It's let's see. Methansar, the Witch Queen of the Fire Coast, unleashes a javelin-like bolt of flame at Krongar. Okay, I'm fine. Great. Let's see. The GM considers this a first magnitude spell for the Witch Queen. She has line of sight, appropriate for a bolt of fire to Krongar, and uses obvious technique. She's always putting on a show. With the first requirement to cast a spell met, and with one additional requirement taken, the cost is reduced to 4 arcane power. The GM thinks the flame is worth 1d6 damage to Krongar. Okay. Pretty simple, right? Some of these, like that one, are fairly simple. I want to cast essentially a magic missile type spell. I've got line of sight, so I'll just make that my line of sight requirement. And then, yeah, something like in combat, obvious technique might not be an issue. So let me put that on there and do that. And then I'll cast it at that level. Maybe I could think of more things to more requirements. It might be difficult in combat, but that's fine. It makes combat, it puts some pressure, or not some pressure. It puts some interesting decisions on the player, how far to go to reduce the cost versus kind of what's needed. You obviously, if you need to do this in combat, you can't use a 30 to 180 minute ritual, right? You may have intimate materials, depending on the situation. Maybe you have a lock of the person's hair or some other thing of theirs. You might have that one. Probably not going to have a chance to ritually clean yourself, but you could give yourself some damage. You could do something like, I'm going to cut my arm and transfer kind of that damage to Krongar, for example. But it's up to you as the wizard, or the player as the magician or wizard, of course, having that conversation with the GM to determine it. So they get to decide. It's not, oh, I'm going to look at the spell. Oh, the spell says that I have to make sounds and do whatever. It's like, no, these are all just tools in the magician's trade to cast spells, but you essentially get to pick which one of those you want to do. And of course, as a GM, we could create more of these if we wanted to. I can't remember the exact spells I did, but I did a lot of spells where I was trying to use the abilities of creatures we would come across. So let's say I might find a rat skeleton or a dead rat body, and I might use that to try to give disease or some kind of poisonous damage to a creature. And I would try to, and that was my thing. Was this was one of the requirements of the spell, was that I have this rat body. I was kind of playing this sort of grungy, sort of street wizard, but sort of in the wilderness, kind of a wild wizard, a magician, kind of grubby and grungy. So he would pick up all these little things and try to use them. Like, oh, here's the skull of a rat, so I'm going to try to channel through the skull of the rat to make this thing happen. And I really liked doing that. It really made my character really look around at the surroundings in a very different way than I was used to, because I was trying to look at, well, what can I pick up? What can I grab from here that can help me. And I think it really opens up some of the ideas of what you can do in kind of these sort of dungeon or wilderness spaces, because even the kind of flotsam and jetsam of adventuring stuff that other folks would just think, oh, that's garbage, toss it away. If you're a magician, you know, that candle holder that nobody wants because it's too heavy and it doesn't seem to be worth very much money. Suddenly, maybe that's what you use as a requirement to cast a fire type spell, because I like to think of the relationships between objects and their uses. And you think of a candlestick holder and kind of flames, so maybe that helps you cast some kind of fire magic. And I really got a big kick out of that, and it inspired my creativity and my imagination in ways that just flipping through static spells, you know, didn't do. So I really like that. Let's see. No, nothing says that's fun flavor. Yeah, absolutely. And I think you can do a lot of that. But it also has that mechanical element too. It's not just flavor. I could just have and say as part of my casting of my spell, I use a rat skull. But this was, not only was it flavoring it, and it certainly fit the kind of magician that I was playing, but it had a mechanical effect. And if I wanted to start waving my arms and shouting like a crazy man, then that was also flavor, but it was also a mechanical effect, which I dug. Okay, now we get to spells of the second magnitude. These are powerful sorceries indeed, and are often only possible during the course of an adventure if appropriate research and preparations are made between adventures. Mines can be controlled, buildings leveled, and mighty warriors transformed into squeaking oozegs. I don't know what an oozeg is offhand, but they squeak. These spells are defined as activities that would be impossible for a single person. Destroying a door would be a spell of the first magnitude. Destroying a wall is definitely second magnitude. Now, I don't remember, the one thing I'm forgetting is I don't remember how fast you get your points back, but it's not, hey, you get them back after a long rest or overnight, right? So when they talk about how many you can do over an adventure, they're being kind of literal. An adventure that might take a week or whatever, you're gonna start to, you know, you're gonna lose, or as you're using up your spell points or those arcane points, you're gonna be getting down. So you have to make those decisions, right? Which I think makes it even more important as the player to really think about how many requirements I can pile onto these things to make it useful, or to be able to cast more spells. So you take a spell like Detect Magic, let's say, right? And first you think, well, that's kind of a low-level spell, but even if I don't know, maybe I would say that's a cantrip. Maybe I would say, no, it's probably a first magnitude spell, however you put it there. But either way, it's 1 or 2 points or 5 points. And now I'm thinking, well, I can't just be willy-nilly casting Detect Magic. We really need to do that when we're camping. That way I can use that casting spell to do it or casting time to do as a ritual, and use these other things, right, to drive that cost down as far as possible, which makes nice decisions not only for when am I casting the spell, but then also means if something looks interesting, I can't just cast Detect Magic. We got to decide, are we going to take it with us because we think it's interesting, or are we going to sit here and wait for an hour while this ritual is cast? You know, what are we going to do? And those interesting decisions I like a lot, and putting all that kind of somewhat pressure, but I think in a fun way, on the players is deciding the risk reward of these different ventures. And on the one calculus, I only have a certain amount of arcane power, and I'm not just going to get it back at the drop of a hat. And I don't remember what the recharge is like. Maybe you get a little bit back on a long rest. I don't recall. We can look it up maybe afterwards. And then how badly do we need it? How can I add requirements to try to mitigate those costs? You know, et cetera, et cetera. I like all those decisions. Okay, so let's get back to spells of the second magnitude. Okay, so spells of the second magnitude, these cost 10 arcane power. For every casting requirement after the first that the magician can comply with or chooses, you can reduce the cost by 1 point down to a minimum of 6. And here we get some suggestions for second magnitude spells. An extended suggestion, instant hypnotism, visions of happenings across the city or within a lifetime, summoning lesser demons. And then we have just the summary of that, right? So it starts off at 10. We can drop it down through taking extra requirements, but to no lower than 6. And they're just tougher to do in general than first magnitude spells. And that was my wife leaving off camera, so that's who I was waving to. Let's see. Okay, so, and then we have additional requirements for second magnitude spells. They're kind of similar to the first one, but they're going to be more demanding, right? So a special item in this case for a second magnitude spell is an ancient tome, a tablet, or a delicate scroll. But this one is more difficult to obtain. It's not something you're just going to get in town at the old bookstore. You're going to have to kind of do more to get one. So which means that kind of logistics and planning, which is other stuff that I like, is, hey, we have an adventure. We need to go here. I, as a magician, I'm thinking, okay, but over there, we're probably going to need this spell. And to cast that spell, I need this thing that we need to go adventure over here to get first. So it's kind of like, it's really like a player-led plot hook, right? You say, okay, but you're going to need this tome, and this tome you're going to have to get from that guy who is now over there. So it's like an instant, plot hook. Rare ingredients, kind of the same thing. You're going to need to make an expedition to go get this item, and it's going to take multiple weeks and a bunch of gold. And here they give you numbers, which means you could abstract it out and say, hey, it's going to cost, it takes, 4 weeks and it's going to cost however much gold. But of course you could, another sort of instant adventure hook, you could turn that into another adventure. Another requirement is a permanent focus. The caster must undertake ritual tattooing to permanently inscribe the details of the spell on his or her person, which is very cool, but it takes time, right? You can't do that at the sperm of the moment, right? That's going to take time. In this case, you can again extend the casting time, but this time by hours instead of minutes. You can sacrifice an animal. You can cast it during a specific phase of the moon, which again is going to limit the amount of time you can do it. If I need a full moon to cast it and it's only a quarter gibbous moon, I got to wait a while before I can cast the spell. But again, as a magician, they can choose that, right? So you could try to time it. Oh, it's a full moon tonight. Great. I will use that to cast the spell. Otherwise, something else. They're not set in stone. Let's see. You can undertake a personal ordeal when you fast for 2 to 12 days. You can take more wounds, or you can do it as a group. And they've got an example again. Tank Pal says, sorry, I missed the beginning of the stream. Very interested in the subject. I only know the basics of the system. I did have some issues with the stream, but Tank Pal, you happily missed those. So hopefully things will be smooth from here on out, because I did have some stuttery connection stuff. But I'm glad you made it. Okay, so let's get to the example here of the second magnitude spell. Methan Sar has managed to capture Krongar. It would please her to make the big barbarian into her lapdog, to pay him back for having the temerity to dare to come to her fortress to steal from her. While he is languishing in the Witch Queen's cells, she researches the spell. It would normally cost 10 arcane power, but she sends some of her Kalukan sentinels out to an old tomb to fetch a grimoire that she has heard about. She fasts for a week and studies the stars for the best time to perform the spell. So we can see here what you can go. And here they're abstracting it out, which it makes sense in this case for an NPC casting it. They've got minions. They can send them out. They could do the same thing, right? If you're playing in a system like a BX system where you have hirelings, you could potentially send the hirelings out to do something. And of course, you could kind of create a role to determine how successful they are, or how long it takes them, or so on and so forth. Or kind of like I would probably do is let the party go out and do that. But the party may choose to send lesser folks to do it and not waste their time with it, which is fine. And you play that out accordingly. But you can see here kind of right. You can imagine here if Methan Sar was a player character, how she would think about, here are the different ways that I can drop the requirements of spell to something that I can cast, and then going through it and taking those steps. When she has all those things together, Methan has Krongar brought to her in chains, and she sacrifices a small beast. She has now met the first spell requirement plus 3 additional ones, reducing the arcane power cost to 7. The GM determines it is a tough task roll. She still needs to make a task roll to defeat Krongar's mind, which is 0, so no worries there. So at the end of all that, there's still a roll. And we can decide in our OSR game however we want that roll to be, whether you want it to be an intelligence roll under intelligence or whatever you'd like to be, right? So you have to go through all that stuff and then make a kind of roll, which is still going to be tough. It's not meant to be easy. And I don't know if they've said whether you have to spend the arcane power regardless of whether you make or fail that roll. It's probably up to you. Maybe I don't know, depending on how strict or loose you want to be, or nice or not nice to your spellcasters, whether it's hey, it's just tough luck. You spent all the energy. It didn't work at the end. Or it didn't work, so you get your spells. I mean, the nice thing, is it took so long to put this together that even if you say, okay, you've got your arcane power, it's not like they can just try it again, because now they have to go find more stuff again, spend more weeks doing that stuff. It's right. It's not an automatic, like they can just sit there and go pew, 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 right? In sort of in combat rounds, just casting the spell over and over until it works. So there's kind of a natural control there to kind of repeating tasks. And then we get to spells of the third magnitude. These are incredibly rare in any game. These spells bring about natural disasters and terrible curses spanning generations. Such spells cost 15 arcane power. For every casting requirement that the caster complies with, reduce the arcane power cost by 1. The minimum cost for spells of a third magnitude is 11 arcane power. And here we have some suggestions, and these are obviously major spells. So they're going to have big effects, causing natural disasters, creating mental slaves, long-term hallucinations or nightmares, visions of distant lands in the ancient past, summoning greater demons. So just to recap, 15 arcane power. Requirements can drop it down, but no further than 11. And it's even more difficult a roll you're going to have to make at the end to make this stick. And the requirements you get to get into for the third magnitude is a personal ordeal. They have to undertake ritual scarring or mutilation and bloodletting to get in the right mental state for casting. You can have it take up to 18 hours of meditation. You can make a ritual sacrifice. So this time it has to be a sentient being. You can only cast the stars. You might only cast it when the alignments of the stars and planets are correct. You might have to do it at a particular place of power. You might take on a demonic transformation in order to cast a spell, suffer a bunch of wounds to cast a spell, do it as a group ritual. And what I like about here, and remember, especially if we're taking this stuff out of Barbarians of Lemuria, we can change these however we like, but you really get the swords and sorcery kind of vibe of these. The kinds of requirements you have are the ones that you would see in the old Sinbad movies. When I have a couple of them, and there's one of them, I think it's the one with Doctor Who. The one from the 70s, my favorite Doctor Who, Tom, I can't remember his name now. Anyway, Tom Baker, who my favorite Doctor Who, but Tom Baker plays this sorcerer, and as he is the bad guy against Sinbad and his band of good guys, and as he is casting spells, he is consistently aging himself. Kind of starts off where you see it on his hands, and then slowly he's sort of aging. And his whole plan is, if he's able to pull off getting this thing that he's trying to get to before Sinbad can get to, is that he can then reverse all this effect. So he's willing to just really go for it in terms of expending his life force, because he feels like if he can get to, I think it's getting to a pool or making a wish or something, I forget exactly, something at a pool, he can get there, you can do that, he can undo it. So he's willing to go for it. But even going for it, he can only cast so many spells, and he doesn't cast that many spells throughout the course of this adventure. It's a few. He tries to make them count, but that was always fun. That's a great movie, Damon Simpson. Absolutely. Oh, and other people putting Tom Baker, right. And then, yes, the succubus, right? He had a little, I think it was more of a homunculus, right? Was it a homunculus or succubus? It could fly, but he had this little creature that he was using. And I don't remember if it was a succubus or a homunculus or both, but it was definitely like a little creature that he sort of animated that would be his spy. There's another Sinbad movie with a woman, a woman sorcerer who does similar things. And I don't know if it's aging, but there's that cost she's expending through each use of her magic. So she has all these immense abilities, but each time she casts something, it pulls something away from her that it's either difficult or impossible for her to get back. And so I like that with these spells, as you increase the power level of these spells, you have that kind of sword and sorcery vibe of you have to pay the cost. And kind of what I was trying to do with my magician when I was playing, there's a trick of how much bang can I get for my buck. We're trying to keep my costs down. and also allowing for some kind of reserve that if I really get into something nasty, I can try to pull out. Maybe I don't think I ever cast any spells that were over the first magnitude, but can I then increase it and do something more powerful? And then you get to have fun as a player with because you're choosing the cost. It's not something that, that I love. People like spell burns and all these different things, and it's kind of fun, the randomness, but there's this other part where it does have a bit of a punishing effect. I like here that whatever is going to happen to the magician is chosen by the magician. They kind of get to choose that. So they get sort of pick their poison and live with it, which I dig. I mean, I don't really have anything against kind of spell burns and wild magic and stuff like that, but there's something to me I do appreciate of having to be in control as the player of this is the price I want to pay. The Tom Baker sorcerer, I think obviously chose that his relationship was going to be with this aging thing, and that's just how he did it, and that kind of made him that sort of sorcerer, and kind of you can play that, right? So here's an example. Volkfind the Black is planning to raise a volcano in the middle of the hero's hometown. So clearly a third magnitude spell. The GM rightly assesses this spell as being a third magnitude, and as Volkfind is an NPC, selects the stars are right as the first casting requirement and ritual sacrifice as the second one. Volkfind has arranged for Princess Somua to be kidnapped from her royal palace in Satarla. These two requirements reduce the arcane cost to 14. The heroes only have 30 days to stop the evil sorcerer and rescue Princess Somua before the coming eclipse spells their doom. Oh, what do we got? I'll have to look. Let's see. Terrence says, which one is it? The Golden Voyage? I will look afterwards because obviously I'm on live and I could run to my DVD shelf, but it's in a whole other room. So rather than do that and disrupt everything, I will go and look. And I have a box set of the Harryhausen Sinbad movies, and there's I think 3 of them in there, and those are 2 of the 3. So if you look up, and maybe I'll find the Amazon link to it, the Harryhausen. I think that, well, I don't know if it's Harryhausen, just his general movies, and 2 of them are Sinbad's, or well, I think I have 2 box sets. Okay, I'm confusing myself. I have a Harryhausen box set, and I have a Sinbad box set. I know they're both in the Sinbad box set. Golden Voyage, the one, let's see, David Sims saying 73. That might be the Tom Baker one. I know the Tom Baker one's in the early 70s, and I want to say the other one is a little bit before that. But I'd have to look it up. But I will look them up, and I will put them in the show notes or drop in the chat or somewhere, because they are great. They are great flicks, and very, very, very flavorful. Let's see. Okay, so that was the so what I like about this, right? So here they're explaining in terms of an NPC, because these kind of spells are probably more NPC appropriate, but it's kind of neat that players could do that. But here's the key is, right, that I think the planning this all to go, right, they planned ahead. So they said, okay, 30 days to get there, which gives you, again, if you have, it's ultimately it ends up becoming, unless your PCs are doing it, well, even if your PCs are doing it, you get this window where they have to spend a bunch of time to set up this big ritual to do something. If it's the PCs that are doing it, now they're vulnerable because they are spending their time preparing it, and they can potentially be interrupted by NPCs, potentially powerful ones, who get wind of their plan. Maybe they need to hold a special location because they're doing that in a place of power, or they need some kind of ritual sacrifice to do it. And it has to be something sentient, and I think it also has to be fitting, right? So in this case, the NPC is sacrificing a princess. They didn't just grab some hobo off the street. It's got to be somebody with meaning. And these things are going to have consequences, right? So you have to grab somebody, has to be a prince or a princess or a king or something. Then that's serious business to do, and it means you're going to have serious opposition. If it is an NPC that's casting it, and again, it's like instant plot hook. Someone has kidnapped the princess. Maybe you get wind from other quarters that there is a plot going on. Suddenly, boom, just this casting of the spell. That's a great plot point. And then, of course, it's got a natural consequence, and it's kind of mechanically built. You don't even have to wonder about, well, how long is this going to take? You kind of have the seeds are all there, right? Lunar cycles are 28 days. If you're doing a sort of a celestial cycle, I'm not sure. I forget how long they are, but you already have these sort of time frames that you kind of have built in. You don't have to wonder about it. You don't have to do it. And then it gives different ways, right? How could the heroes stop this? If Volkfin had chosen to kidnap the princess, get that alignment, celestial alignment, and then maybe they also did a place of power, then you have at least, you can't stop the stars from aligning unless you're going to cast your own third magnitude spell, but you can both free the princess and you can also try to prevent him from getting to the place of power or get there before him or some other prevent him, which probably would help you get the princess anyway. But you can see that you have multiple angles to try to affect this if you're the PCs, and also if you're NPCs. If you're PCs and you decide we're going to find this place of power, then they may need to displace whomever is holding that place of power. And since it is a place of power, it's probably not just unoccupied, right? Such important places would not just be sitting there in ruins unless they were lost to time or history, in which case you get into the, well, we have to do the research and undertake expeditions. And this is all plot hook, goodness. Seventh Voyage and Eye of the Tiger. Those are probably them. They all sound familiar. I think I have all of those. They're great. All those Sinbad movies are great. And they're definitely a great inspiration for these kind of sorcerers and that kind of magic. And I always like that they're sort of powerful, but they're limited. And, and of course, on a systemic kind of mechanical level, it's how do you balance that great power with those limitations, right? And they found ways to do it narratively in the story. It might take some work to make those into, gameable things. Because one of the things I thought is if you were, you take the Tom Baker sorcerer, he was getting older. Is that in human years getting older, or is it some percentage of his lifespan? Because you think about it and you think, well, in a fantasy game, he might be an elven sorcerer. And if an elven sorcerer is aging a couple of years, when they do something, it's like no big whoop, right? Hey, age 50 years. What does the elf care? The elf's got thousands of years to play with if you're doing your kind of typical, extremely long-lived or almost immortal elf. So what does that mean? But if it does something else, and of course, you could always break it out onto a creature level. Maybe magic for elves is something different. If you're going kind of Tolkien-style elves, maybe for elves, it's that longing to cross the sea, which essentially means really if they kind of fail that kind of longing and succumb to it, then they're just out of the game, which is akin to dying, though it's not really dying. Maybe for dwarves, depending on what kind of dwarvishness you have, you could find some kind of dwarvish price. So there's a lot of, once you kind of get into there, you can find a lot of ways to make it flexible for whichever kind of game you're playing. All right, let's see recovering arcane power. The caster recovers 4 arcane power spent to create first magnitude spells at either noon or midnight. And you have to make the magician or the sorcerer is going to choose, but they have to choose for it forever. So they can choose midnight or they can choose noon. Can't flip-flop. They're picking one. Also, whatever you spent on cantrips is recovered at noon and at midnight. So the one thing is a little extra bookkeeping, a little mathiness. You have to separate what you spent on cantrips versus what you spent on first magnitude spells, because they're going to recover at different rates. I mean, you could probably figure out a way to split the difference, but I think it's important because you'll see, because of how they do it for the other magnitudes, that you kind of keep them separate. But it is a little bit of extra bookkeeping. It is not in that way, not dissimilar from spell slots, and that you sort of have to keep them distinct. Arcane power spent in the creation of second and third magnitude spells are recovered at the rate of 4 points per lunar month. Usually the first night of the full moon, but they can choose their phase. Additionally, when the sorcerer casts a third magnitude magic, a point of arcane power is permanently lost. This loss of arcane power can be exchanged for the loss of an attribute point instead, down to negative numbers if necessary. For example, it could represent aging and so reduce the magician's appeal by 1. Or life drain. Yep, life drain. What is aging be? Con loss, maybe? Yeah, it could be. I think you could see it as con loss. That would actually probably be a good way to do it, because that is very much creature independent, right? Because everything has a specific con, and elves and dwarves and other kind of humanoid playable races don't have massive cons more than humans. So yeah, that might actually be a really good way to do that. So when you're recovering arcane power, cantrips will recover fastest, then first magnitude spells. Second magnitude spells, if you couldn't, you're not getting it basically for a month. Obviously, you can try to time it so that it's right near when your cycle will reset and you'll get them back. But barring that, they're gone for a month. If you cast a third magnitude spell, you are losing one arcane power forever, unless you take it as something else. And essentially, There, you can do it as a tribute point loss, which would be akin to what we were talked about in chat, which is you could take con loss, something else. They talk about they actually use aging as appeal right there, charisma. So your charisma goes down, but con loss might be a better one for aging. You can figure it out. You can do however you want. And then they have here they have some types of spells that have a particular sword and sorcery flavor. So a few just examples. A wasting, withering disease that causes the victim to slowly die while their loved ones look on hopelessly. Bewitchment or possession, maybe turning someone into a living zombie. Animation of the dead. Seeing into other dimensions. Creating terrible storms or call lightning. Summoning spells, etc., etc. And then they do give you some examples. So if you're playing Barbarians of Lemuria or you're running it, these are ones that you could look at, hand out to your PC if they decided they were going to play someone with magician points, decide and say, look at these. For me, I found a lot of the fun was in making my own spells, but that takes time. So it's nice to have things like these that you can look at a moment's notice in a game when you might not have inspiration, B, you might not want to spend half an hour or whatever it takes to kind of suss out the details. I'm not sure it would take that long. And I'm sure the more comfortable you got in the system, the quicker you could do it. But it's nice to have a few things that you can do. And of course, once you've created some spells, hopefully you write them down so that you can repeat them and you know all the everything that's attached to them. And you'll just kind of you'll be creating your own spell list, your own grimoire as you play, which I think is kind of neat. And of course, if you're playing multiple characters in an ongoing game, those could become spells that other characters use. You could be creating your own fully, customized spell list for a particular campaign world. And as a GM, you can do that in advance too. You could go through and say, here's a bunch of spells, make your own. And they did that back in the day because all those spells that had casters' names on the end of them, right? Tensor's disc and all that stuff were named after the players whose characters created those spells originally. So it's not without precedent in the D&D universe. I don't know if I need to go through these examples. So we have some of the first magnitude, some of the second magnitude, some of the third magnitude, and then we get into cults and stuff, kind of more, world building stuff for Lemuria. Whew. All right. So I ended up taking a good part of an hour. Unfortunately, I think at least about 10 minutes of that, or maybe less. I don't know. It was marred by technical difficulties. So I wanted to go through that because I just think it's a really cool system. And I wanted to highlight it because I think it's one of the highlights of Barbarians of Lemuria in general. And it is something that I wonder if it could be pulled out and put into a more vanilla OSR game. To me, it has a really nice flavor. I'm not a big fan of the Harry Potter pew pew magic. It's probably just because at my age. I grew up with more sort of deliberate, strange magic. I was born in '73, so obviously I did not see the Tom Baker Sinbad movie when it first came out, but I definitely remember watching those kind of things on Saturday morning TV, and figures like Merlin and Gandalf were casting these sort of more major or impressive or really even subtle effects that were more deliberate than, whipping wands around and kind of casting a constant stream of lightning bolts at each other. So that's just kind of what I like. But I do like the idea of not being locked into a particular set of spells, and you can really customize it. If you have a really interesting idea for a magician, then you can really have a really interesting set of spells that are just that magician spells that maybe nobody else has because he's been doing them or she's been doing them themselves. So it's really cool. Tank Pow says, I really like it and would like to work on taking it and making it generic. Would really like to use it in my new Lamentations of Flame Princess. Yeah, for sure. Though the one thing in Lamentations I would keep is the summoning spell. I love the summoning spell in Lamentations. I would find some way, maybe even make it its own thing to use Lamentations summoning, because that is really great. And there is a cool website or web app for generating summoned creatures, which helps a lot. I think if we were going to convert this, and again, I don't have a set idea. Whoops, where did I go? I don't have a set sort of mechanics already in my brain for doing it. So we would think of maybe we just have to go with arcane points. We might be able to say, so if I'm thinking correctly, the arcane points, if you go full magician, I believe that you're starting arcane points, because I think, okay, so going back, if you were to take on the magician occupation or whatever, I forget what they call it, and you take that as your main occupation, which means it would have 4 points in it, then you would start off with 14 arcane points. So that's probably a little bit more than the average of your intelligence score. So maybe you might say, hey, we'll start with, so if you were going to play like in OSR, you're just playing a magic user, maybe you'd say, okay, 14, and then I guess you could just say 14. I was going to say plus or minus your intelligence, but I kind of like that your attributes don't really affect that stuff too much. Now, Nothing says, I don't like the idea of defining the spells on the fly, but if they are researched ahead of time, it's an interesting system. Yeah, I'm curious, what do you have against generating them on the fly? Because I can tell you as a player, I loved generating them on the fly. I mean, I remember one moment that was cool, really, in my mind, I made a really cool moment. So the party was in a boat floating down a river, and the enemies were coming up in this boat behind them, and I made a first magnitude spell to have a large wave and basically capsize the other boat. And my reasoning was that this is something that a normal person could do, aka push the boat over. But obviously I'm doing it by magic means. But it was a really neat moment, both in my thinking kind of quickly of, okay, what can I do to solve the situation? And it was something that wasn't lethal, wasn't doing a ton of damage. It was obviously just going to impair or really prevent their pursuit of us. So that was a really neat moment, and I wouldn't have been able to do that if I had to think of it in advance, because I never would have thought of that spell in advance. So that was something that really came out of the moment. Let's see. Tank Pal says, what about using something like Psionic PowerPoints, Psionic Second Edition, or LeBlanc's BX Psionics? I don't know BX Psionics. I might have to check that out. I don't remember Psionics in Second Edition. Tank Pal also says, love spells on the fly. I've played a lot of Mage the Ascension and love the idea of translating something like that into a BX form. Very exciting to me as a world builder. Absolutely. Now, Nothing says, using defined spells in an awesome way is amazing, but you can make up the spell on the fly. It's less special when it happens. Now, Nothing, I would disagree with that. And like I just said in my example, I don't want to repeat it. I think that made that moment very special because I came up with this. And I think it ends up being really flavorful and really special. There's nothing wrong with coming with a cool way to use an existing spell, but there is also something cool with taking the little bits that are around you that me as the GM, or in this case as a player, the GM has put around you and using them in a really novel, interesting way. I think you're giving it short shrift by assuming that it'll make things not special. Maybe in some far future date, you'll think like, oh, this is boring now, but I didn't find that the case at all. And of course, there are limits to how much you could do that because you just don't have unlimited spell points. You still have to pick and choose your spots. Let's see. David Sem says, I always hated having to guess what spells I may need. Yeah, I mean, that was part of the, I didn't mind that so much. So I think he's getting to, like, you were a wizard and you had to choose which spells you memorized. To me, that was part of like the game within the game. And I actually got a kick out of trying to figure out what I'm going to need. But there was also that pain in the butt thing of like, I think I'm going to need this, and then I don't need it. And so then there's other spell that I had that I could have used that I don't use. So I feel you. But at the same time, I actually used to get a kick out of that because there's nothing, that sense of accomplishment when you're like, I got use of every spell that I memorized. I was like, bam, you get to the end of the gaming day and you're at camp and you're like, man, I nailed every one of my choices. It's kind of a cool feeling. But yeah, there is a downside, and that is that you can get kind of jammed up. And sometimes you can't always. Sometimes you can look at it and say, oh, I should have known to take this. And other times it's like, I had no idea, or somebody else goofed. And so we end up, whatever. Like, I get it, but I did kind of like that gaminess. Let's see. Players who are improvisational may have more of an advantage. Yes. Right. So I had the advantage when I was playing the magician of being able to have play by post. So I had time to think about things. That is why it's good, I think, to have a combination of have some spells in your back pocket that are kind of pre-created or pre-arranged, and then have that idea that maybe when other people are doing things, you can also be thinking of what spell might work in that situation. Because, yeah, if you're not someone who's good at just, getting in the moment and just coming up with something. There was kind of a little bit of, I felt like the way I was channeling, I felt like I was channeling like an Arcane MacGyver a little bit, seeing what little bits and pieces and putting them together. That's not to say you have to play your magician in this kind of system like that. That's just what I did. But yes, if you don't find, you need more time to think about it, then yeah, more advanced planning. The nice thing is you can do both. You can create spells in advance, and you can think about stuff to use in the moment. You don't have to choose one or the other. Tank Pal, okay, you put a link to the Sonics book in the comments. Such an amazing book and a solid system. All right, I will check that out. So just to wrap up, I really love this system. I'm not sure how I would put this in the OSR. I think that there are probably some good ideas. I think we could leverage. We know what we could say that we have a baseline of 14 as your arcane points to start, which essentially is what a full wizard gets, or a full magician in in Barbarians of Lemuria gets if they're a full magician, which you would be if you were a magic user. And then maybe we could say you get a level for the rest of the way, so that a 10th level wizard would have 24. Or maybe you say they don't get any more. You could do something else. The checks you have to roll, we could figure out some way to do that. Maybe using a save versus spells. That could be a way that if you're rolling to see how difficult something is, it could be a save versus spells with some penalties. Or, yeah, I guess it would just be penalties, right? Because the difficulties only get harder. They don't get easier. So we could have some kind of, you could just use that save versus spells, and then it could just be figure out what kind of number makes sense for the penalties as you scale up in the magnitudes of the spells. I think right there is maybe a first good, not good, a first kind of draft, a first cut at what it might look like. Of course, you'd want to play test it and see what it looks like, but I feel like there's something to work with there. And with anything, what's going to be interesting is some D&D spells are going to be much harder than others. To do something like a fireball in this system is tough because you're doing, it depends on how you think of it, right? So you could probably sell fireball as a first magnitude spell if you suggest that it's about the same as a Molotov cocktail. But that would mean you're only doing a D6 damage to each. If you wanted to get that kind of 6d6 damage, I think you were in that second magnitude spell, which means you're only going to be able to cast very few fireballs. Likewise, permanent charm, like you get kind of a low level charm, right? First level charm is insanely strong, though of course there are limitations in the D&D version depending on how intelligent the target is. That's not a first level type easy spell in this system, but other spell effects that are at different levels might be easier. Levitation, when you consider it, and you have to look at kind of the ends, right? Like their example of, you're climbing a wall, you can levitate up the wall. Levitation is a higher level spell, but in this case, it's kind of easy. So it's going to take some things and make them much more difficult. Some things are going to be easier, which is fine with me. But there might be a little bit of a learning curve or adjustment period where you get a feel for, here are the things that I'm used to being higher level spells that are now relatively low level, or at least easier spells to do. And then spells that were easy to do that now are difficult. The other thing I like is you're not gated from doing anything. If you can get it down to within the points you have to spend, you can do it. So if you want to try something insane, it may be really hard to make that roll at the end of it, but you can try it. You're right. You start off with 14 points. I think the only thing that you can't do, how many was a third magnitude? So the only thing that you can't get, even a third magnitude spell, you can drop down to 11 minimum. So you're able to, at level 1, drop something massive down on folks, but you're gonna have to work it, at least do 2 different requirements, right? You may be like that, maybe you don't. It's going to be a really hard, difficult roll to make, so you can determine what that looks like if you're using save versus spells or some other kind of roll. If you want to do use that kind of cleric turning table and do some kind of 2d6 roll, you could figure out what that might look like. But definitely kind of opens things up for your wizard. Of course, they're going to lose. They're going to have to figure out how to deal with the loss. And once they do that, they're going to be mostly out of spells. If they spend 11 out of their 14 points on a single spell, then for quite a period of time in their adventure, they're going to have no spells or just a couple of cantrips, right? So they could try something really risky but huge, or they can kind of do more, lower level spells that they can kind of milk along and use for lesser advantages. I will check out that psionics book in the comments. I think I will wrap it here. Again, sorry for the fluky connections at time. I'm glad it didn't drop me completely out of the stream, because then it is hard to get back into the stream. I'm not sure what I'm going to stream about yet tomorrow. So my game is tonight, my home game. I may do another kind of after action report, but in stream form tomorrow. It might depend on what they do. They're going to be, if you watch the other after action report that I did over the weekend, I think it came out Monday or Sunday night. It was kind of a portentous game. So there's kind of stuff to talk, or a portentous session. So there's stuff to talk about. Now it's going to be more kind of, they're going to be sort of in recovery kind of regrouping mode. So there might not be a lot going on. So if there's not a lot going on, I probably won't spend the whole time talking about it, because nothing to talk about. Or I could maybe possibly start going back and filling in earlier gaps in the story. We'll see. Friday, Bandits Keep will be in here to talk about Undead. So I'm looking forward to that. If you happen to be in the chat and you're not subscribed to the channel, please subscribe to the channel and give it a thumbs up if you've enjoyed yourself, you had fun, you found it informative. Subscribe to the channel. It helps me out a lot. Thanks for joining me, everybody. Had a great time as usual. I will hopefully see most, if not all of you, mañana, at least as far as the streaming goes. And of course, I also put these on podcast form, and they are archived both on YouTube and also on Odyssey. If you're familiar with Odyssey, all the stuff that's on YouTube also ends up on Odyssey. So that's another way you can check it out. So have a great end of your rest of your day. If you're here in the stream, or night, weekend, morning, whenever, if you're watching or listening to this later, game on, and I'll talk to you later.